This is episode 76 with internationally recognized yoga expert, endurance sports coach, and the author of 8 books on running and yoga, Miss Sage Rountree. Hi everyone, this is your host Jason Fitzgerald, and welcome to another episode of the Strength Running Podcast, where it's my job to bring you the best of the best. Elite runners, top coaches, renowned scientists, best-selling authors, and other experts in the fields of health, nutrition, and performance. The goal? To tease out actionable strategies and ideas to help you plan smarter training and get better results. And our guest today is quite the rock star. I'm speaking with Sage Rountree, who is the authority on yoga for endurance runners. She's written 8 books, including The Athlete's Guide to Yoga, Racing Wisely, Everyday Yoga, and The Runner's Guide to Yoga. She has a PhD in English literature and the highest level of yoga certification possible with the Yoga Alliance. She's worked with everyone from casual athletes to NFL and NBA players and even Olympians. And our discussion today focuses on yoga for runners and how it can be used in your training to enhance recovery, athleticism, and performance. We're going to talk more about its benefits, what you can expect, how to schedule it in your training, the importance of periodizing your yoga practice, and a lot more. And before we start, I do want to thank SteadyMD for making this show possible. SteadyMD pairs you with a primary care doctor who's also a runner online. This is someone who really understands training and the demands that it puts on your body. So if you're dealing with an injury or you're fearing the early warning signs of overtraining, your doctor is now going to be available to you via phone, text, and video chat anytime. Go to steadymd.com/strengthrunning to reserve your spot and check out all of the details. And I think if you're an athlete who does need true preventative care tailored to your unique medical needs and lifestyle, you're really going to benefit from this. More of the details are on steadymd.com/strengthrunning. Okay, everyone, it's time for my conversation with the great Sage Rountree. Hi, Sage. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
So I'm excited to talk with you about yoga because you literally wrote the book, The Runner's Guide to Yoga.
Yeah, I've written many books on yoga for athletes and also on the art of athletic recovery and the science of athletic recovery, which is a complement to yoga.
Yes, exactly. You've written The Athlete's Guide to Recovery, The Athlete's Guide to Yoga, lots of different topics. I was on Amazon earlier just looking at all the books that you've written. How many have you written at this point?
Number 8 is at the publisher.
Number 8 is at the publisher. Well, congratulations.
Thanks.
Let's go back and maybe start with a very basic question. And this is one that I would say lands in my inbox probably once every 2 or 3 weeks. Should I do yoga? What are the benefits? When should I add this to my program? So maybe you can just speak a little bit to why runners should think about adding yoga to their training plan and what physical skills yoga develops that might be valuable for runners.
Sure. The short answer is yes, you should do yoga, but exactly what kind of yoga is where we can make or break your season. Because if you are tight and you're tight as a runner for a specific reason, to deliver efficient transfer of energy to the ground and get you moving through space faster. And then you go to a class that pushes you to your edge. And especially if you're coachable and respond well to instructions saying, go, keep going, you could do it, push to the edge, you could hurt yourself. So this happens also just with the general population. Folks are told by their doctor, hey, for your back pain, you should do yoga. But yoga is a huge umbrella that comprises a lot of different approaches and styles and a lot of different levels of physical rigor. So while the short answer is yes, the long answer is yes, once you figure out the right class for your own body and where you are in your training cycle. The closer you are to your peak race, the less physically intense the yoga practice you choose should be. So that complicates the answer of yes. But there are so many benefits for the runner in yoga class. You develop strength. This can be especially useful in the off season or really early in your training cycle. Core strength, of course, but also foot strength because yoga is practiced in bare feet. Some of us are horrified to take our shoes off and see, the the state of our feet. Our toes don't want to separate. It's tough to stand on one leg, but that all improves really quickly with a regular yoga practice. It develops hip strength, which is really useful. It can counteract whatever patterns your body accumulates over the course of your day, not only in your run, but during your commute and your time sitting at a desk. Yoga is a really good antidote to some of the postural patterns that we develop when we're sitting. And it also builds mental strength, which is obviously really critical in races of any distance, whether they're short or long. Yoga also develops flexibility. Flexibility in the hamstrings is something many of us as runners think that we need, but I like to balance that with attention to the hip flexors. And as anybody who's been to a yoga class can probably attest, there are a lot of lunges in yoga class, and the lunge is very similar to the move that we make during the running stride. So it makes sense that we want to have some fluidity and some stability through that lunge position. Yoga develops mental flexibility as well. You find yourself in some poses that are humbling, if not lightly humiliating, but you also find yourself able to appreciate the little gains that you can see from session to session. And finally, yoga develops a sense of balance and presence. And that happens both physically and metaphysically, as it were. That sense of flexibility, like a mental sense of flexibility, we would call equanimity. That means the ability to stay centered in the face of shifting circumstance. And as any of us who have run a marathon know, circumstance is always shifting from mile to mile or quarter mile to quarter mile. And we're able to stay centered and grounded and focused on our original plans when we have some practice being in all different kinds of circumstances that might come up on the yoga mat.
Wow. So clearly there's a lot to like about yoga. There's a lot of different skills and ways of boosting your fitness that yoga can deliver. You mentioned too that really caught my attention. And just from a physical perspective, these were strengthening the feet and working on your posture. And I think because so many of us wear very cushioned or supportive shoes for a majority of the day, we don't spend much time barefoot. A lot of us spend a very big chunk of the day either sitting in front of a computer or, sitting in a chair or on the couch or, something like that when we have, leisure hours. Then, working on these two things, our posture, how we carry ourselves, and the strength of our feet from a running perspective, these are critical. And from an injury prevention perspective, they're things that, as a coach, I'm very interested in because I see them as potentially weak links in, a runner's kind of overall ability to run healthy without any injuries. Now, you did mention there's so many things in your answer that I want to get to, and we're going to unpack that. Sage, you delivered an incredible amount of information in such a concise answer. Thank you for that. But you mentioned types of yoga. Obviously there's a big difference between Bikram and Vinyasa yoga. I've been to those and a hot yoga class, which I understand is not quite as hot as Bikram yoga. But maybe we can, step back and look at all these different yoga practices and kind of understand where someone should start with yoga if they haven't done it before, and maybe you can speak to that.
Happily. The classes that you mentioned, Jason, are at the spicier end of the spectrum. Obviously, hot yoga and Bikram yoga are practiced in the heat. Depending on the place that you went, the room in hot might be anywhere from 80 to 105, or sometimes more if you're in the wrong corner of the room, or the right, depending on how much you like the heat. Bikram can be like 103 to 105 degrees. And in those styles, generally, you're holding poses statically. In vinyasa classes, which you mentioned, that means there's movement from pose to pose, and you might not wind up in any pose for too long. And there are obviously benefits to both of these, but as I said, each of them is pretty much at the spicy end of the spectrum. Those would be great for somebody maybe 3 weeks after their season has ended and they're fully recovered from their race to go and explore as an off-season activity, because they have a lot to offer physically and mentally. But for folks who are totally new to yoga and might be closer to a peak event, I would send them to something far more gentle, like a class called gentle yoga. The thing about gentle yoga for folks who are type A's, as many runners are, is that it can be tough to quiet the mind in the yoga class, and you can find yourself either frustrated or bored. sometimes people say, oh, I went to that class and it was boring. And I get a little high and mighty and I say, the class was not boring. You were bored in the class, which is a very different thing. Those can sometimes be advanced practices to go to a simpler class. Just because it's simple doesn't mean that it's easy when your brain won't turn off. So while that physically might be the right place for people to land, I think something in between might be better. And generally, you'll see those classes called what we would say in America, hatha or hatha yoga. And that means that it's moving at a moderate pace, ideally pretty slowly through a series of physical postures. Another really good place to start is something called like Yoga 101 or beginner yoga, or a series like that where they break things down for total beginners, because then everybody is a beginner. That removes one of the burdens I think runners find when they're coming to yoga classes. It can be really scary. Like there are a lot of very svelte 20-something-year-old women who can touch their toes like before class even starts. And if you self-identify as tighter, or you feel older, or you're just not hip to the vibe of the studio and what's up with the incense and the chanting, all of that can be a major barrier to entry for runners. So a beginner series or beginner's class is often a kinder and gentler way to ease into the practice.
Now, do you always have to go to a class? And I kind of know the answer here. The answer is no, of course.
Yeah.
But, one of the things that I struggled with when I first started doing yoga, I would say back in, maybe 2009, 2010, was that I struggled with doing it for 90 minutes because I kind of jumped into the deep end without a life preserver and got into yoga by doing Bikram yoga with a friend of mine. And while I enjoyed it, I did struggle with the fact that it was about an hour and a half. And
and the dosage there of stress for your body is really pretty high, especially if you're already training a whole lot. You might not have 90 minutes really to carve out. Plus, for those hot practices, as you know, you have to budget time for a shower and bring a garbage bag to put your sopping wet clothes into. Like it's a production. And part of why we like running is that running is easy. You can just head out the door. So Bikram yoga is almost like being a swimmer. Like you have to pack your bag and plan around it and factor in the shower time. So no, you don't have to do yoga in class. In fact, the ways that you can get the most benefit from yoga come from doing it at home in small chunks regularly. Just like with your running, it would be better not to just do one 90-minute run a week, but instead do several runs of 30 minutes. Even if you did only 3 runs of 30 minutes, it's the same amount of time over the course of the week, but it's going to have a really different physiological effect on your body. The reason I like to send people to class at the beginning of their yoga career is so that they can have a teacher's eyes on them and make sure that they're not developing bad habits. Because there are some patterns we can get into with our bodies that over time might put undue stress on our knees, or where a little alignment tweak that your teacher might offer you in the course of a cue of only a few words might make the whole pose just blossom for you and feel a lot easier. So it's good to have a balanced diet that maybe starts out with a beginner series at the studio, but then is weighted with a whole lot of home practice. Just like it's good to go to restaurants, but you don't want to go to restaurants all the time. Like you really should be nourishing yourself at home.
I like that. Now, you kind of bring up a second question I was going to ask about frequency. How, for the average runner, the average recreational athlete, how much yoga is necessary? And maybe you can go into how often or how frequent a runner could potentially practice yoga, and then for how long each individual session might be.
Right. I would rather see more frequency and lesser duration in each session. So again, like 3 times 30 minutes would be better than 1 times 90 minutes over the course of the week. It depends what the runner's individual needs are. Does she need to work on her balance? Is she interested in breath capacity and breath awareness and using the breath to support her running? Does she want core strength? So all of that kind of depends. And if I had answers to each of those, then I can devise a plan. Like when I'm writing yoga for my coaching clients, I will put in something, depending on each of their individual needs. But in general, 3 times 15 minutes, I think would show you plenty of good shift in your body. And that could be a dynamic warm up before a run that develops your awareness of where your body is in space, that wakes up your lower legs. We already talked about the importance of foot strength, that sets a good posture guideline that you can then take into your run, that maybe puts a mantra in your mind. And we haven't even talked about some of the wonderful benefits of yoga beyond the physical practice. Or sometimes it means you get back from your run and you do a few stretches down on the floor. But doing more frequency and less duration is probably going to be the best for most of us as runners.
Now, you mentioned warming up before a run. Now, I'm a very adamant believer in a dynamic warm-up pre-run, particularly before a challenging run, like a workout, or definitely before a race. What is the functional difference between a series of dynamic stretches versus a series of yoga movements that might be really similar? Is there a big difference between the two, or is it just, yoga people call it yoga and running coaches say dynamic stretches?
That's exactly what I would say. It's more just a difference of vocabulary than a difference in the physiology.
Got it. Now, you also brought up a really interesting point earlier, and you've been kind of reinforcing this with talking about where a runner might be in their season or if they're between seasons. And I wanted to ask you about periodizing yoga, much in the same way that you would periodize a training plan or even a strength training program. Obviously there's really hard yoga. You could do a shorter, much easier session. How do you advise runners to strike the balance between easy and more intense? And how does that fit into kind of the flow of a season from beginning to end?
Great question. So I have two answers that at first might sound like they're contradictory, but I'll try to explain how they aren't. The first is that over the broad picture, what we might call the macro cycle or the course of a whole training season, the physical intensity of the yoga practice ought to be in inverse proportion to the physical intensity of the run training and just the general physical training. So early on in the season, you could try for a spicier style of yoga, but the closer you get to your taper and your peak, the more mellow the physical yoga practice needs to be. So right there, it's just a simple inverse proportion. That said, over the course of a training week, I would rather put the harder yoga sessions on medium or even harder run days so that we can keep the easy days easy enough that we're achieving full recovery between hard workout sessions or hard workout days. And I know that kind of sounds like the opposite of inverse proportion, because if you hear inverse proportion and you try to apply that to a week, you might think, oh, I had an easy run, so I'm going to go and do that 90-minute hot Bikram class. Except now we don't have an easy day anymore. We've got like a medium day, and you don't want to fall into the mistake of making every day in the training week a medium day, or else where's the recovery?
Yes, this is exactly like strength training and how it's advised for runners to put a hard lifting workout after a hard running workout, because that day is going to be very challenging. But that then allows your body to gain more fitness. It's a stronger stimulus for adaptation. And then, the following day, you might have a day off completely where you don't do any exercise at all, with the exception of maybe some 10, 15, 20-minute recovery routine, which might be dynamic stretches, yoga, or even a light, core workout or something along those lines. But, to me as a coach, that is exactly how you should structure it on a micro level, kind of placing hard runs with hard strength training or other types of cross training like yoga. But then on a more macro level, you're absolutely right. As runners, our primary form of exercise, the thing that we have to prioritize is running. And if we're doing brutally hard yoga sessions while we're trying to do, challenging long runs and really fast workouts and overall high mileage, something's going to break. And I think that advice is really comforting for me to hear as a coach, that you're kind of prioritizing a runner's most important thing, which is running, and then using yoga as a supplement to it, something that enhances your running rather than competes with it.
Perfect. Exactly.
Now, do you think runners should work on leveling up their yoga practice and try to accomplish more challenging or complex movements, or should they pretty much stick with the basics?
I think the basics are going to serve you longer if the running continues to be your primary goal. But if you have a change of heart and all of a sudden you really want to be on the cover of Yoga Journal with your foot behind your head, then you're going to have to sacrifice some of the stiffness that you need to run well in service of the flexibility you need to achieve some of those poses. But let me tell you, as someone who's gotten into some of those advanced poses, nothing special happens when your foot goes behind your head, and something bad might happen. You might hurt yourself trying to get there. So it's not the end point that is going to make anything special happen. Just like in running, it's really the practice of building toward the goal that teaches you about yourself that's more important than actually getting the medal at the end of any race.
How do you talk to runners who are a little bit hesitant about yoga because they're turned off by any hint of woo-woo Eastern medicine kind of alternative, that whole vibe? What do you say to runners who want nothing to do with that, but do want the kind of practice and exercise of yoga?
Right. Two ways in for them. One is to encourage them to keep looking and try a different teacher or a different studio, because when you find the right one, it's a lot like finding the right running shoe. And you're like, oh, where have you been all my life? This is perfect. And I was just in the wrong shoe before. I was in the wrong place before. Another way to do it might be to go in kind of through a side door, through the practice of Pilates, which is complementary to yoga and actually gives a lot of the same benefits that we've already talked about. It can be so good for us to balance our bodies as runners, but is generally a little less woo-woo.
Yeah, Pilates to me is a little bit more core focused and a little bit less general flexibility focused. Am I off base with that?
Well, the flexibility that you get in Pilates just kind of comes organically from the core strengthening stuff that you do. And I like it for runners because it's not a gratuitous flexibility for flexibility's sake, because we don't need to be that flexible to run well. We just need to be able to move through the running stride with some fluidity, so that we don't have a hitch that leads to injury. But we really don't need the levels of flexibility that you would see in a yoga poster, for example. Well, yes, Pilates definitely has the goal of building core strength. There's some beautiful organic flexibility work that comes through the practice that I think is probably going to be sufficient for most runners if they don't have some kind of pathological tightness.
Can you speak to a little bit the fact that, you've mentioned previously that, you don't have to be super flexible to be a good runner. You simply have to go through the proper range of motion of a running stride without any hitches. And you've also mentioned muscle stiffness. Can you talk about stiffness and flexibility and yoga and running and how they all work together and are related?
I feel like there is, on some level, a zero-sum game happening there. And I alluded to that earlier when I said, if you're trying to get your foot behind your head, you're probably going to need to sacrifice a little bit of the stiffness that you purposely have built as a runner. So I feel like there's a spectrum, and what we want for runners in a yoga class is to find the right middle ground in that spectrum so that they don't go too far to destabilize and release all of the sport specific stiffness that they have, but that they get enough so that they can feel comfortable in their bodies and they have enough flexibility to tie their shoes. But beyond that, they don't need to get their head to their knees in a forward fold, for example.
Right. Now, when it comes to muscle stiffness, what is that? I've written about this in the past, and it's always a topic and a concept that can be a little bit difficult to explain and really have it connect with folks, because it's not, I can barely touch my toes. It's more, my muscles are tense when they're absorbing force from the running stride. Can you help me explain that?
I think you gave a pretty good example of it right there. I think the problem is the word stiff does connote like that feeling you get when you get off the couch after your long run, 5 hours
right.
after your
Which
long
is never
run.
a fun experience.
Oh, no, I'm so stiff and I have to kind of waddle over to the kitchen to get another glass of water. It's not like that. It's more of a springiness and a high tone, like a sense of ability and the ability to contract well and to move energy through the system.
Yeah, I like to use the example of, you can bounce really well on a pogo stick because it's very stiff and it absorbs and then releases a lot of the force of you jumping up and down on it. If you made a pogo stick out of a Twizzler, it's not going to work because it's not stiff. It's not going to absorb any of that force. It's just going to collapse and, lose all of that energy. There's no energy return. And when we talk about running and the stride, stiffness and tension, that's really what we're talking about is, can you land and really have your leg stiffen up so that it absorbs that energy, returns it so that your stride is much more economical and wastes less energy. And I think that yoga can help you move through that stride very fluidly, but you don't have to be a gymnast. You don't have to be, a 500-hour yogi to get all of the, the benefits of that. A little bit goes a long way.
Exactly. And that's where a more movement-based style of yoga, like flow yoga or vinyasa yoga, can be really helpful, because you're moving in and out of the poses and your muscles have to work at different levels of contraction, like toward the longer end and toward the shorter end. And you get to develop a control throughout the whole range of motion that serves you really, really well as a runner.
So Sage, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with you, not just because you've written the book on yoga for runners and really a series of books on yoga for athletes, but because you do actively work with athletes on a regular basis on their yoga practice. And I'm sure that you've encountered a lot of bullheaded type A runners like me who are making a lot of mistakes with their yoga. I was wondering if you could go through some of the common errors or training mistakes that you see runners make when they get into yoga, and maybe also some advanced mistakes that people who have been doing it for years, but they're still kind of, thinking about it incorrectly.
All right. One common mistake is to pay too much attention to what's going on in the room and not enough attention to what's going on in your body, especially if you're in a mixed class that has some tighter bodies, some newer folks who are making the move to use yoga to complement their running, but also some yoga teachers or some ex-gymnasts or some people who tend toward the floppier end of the spectrum. And they can make the poses look easy because they have the levels of flexibility required to make them look easy, but that doesn't mean that that's right for your body. So it's really important to, as we like to say, keep your eyes on your own mat and not worry too much about what's going on around you, because part of the beauty of the practice for runners is to tune into the sensation in your body better, and that serves you well when you're out on the course. So you got to kind of put on some horse blinders and not look to the left or the right. Just look at the teacher and listen to her words and hear, like, what is the right level here? Where should you be feeling it here? And another really good barometer there for knowing that you're doing things right is your breath. And if you find yourself holding your breath or you're grunting or your breath gets caught up in any way, that's usually a sign that you're over-efforting into the pose. Maybe that you got swept up in a sense of competition, which of course is important for us to achieve on the running course, but not really helpful in the yoga studio.
Yes.
Another mistake I see people make is to come to class too close to a peak event. And while you can take somebody who has years of practice in a class and he might be totally fine coming to class the day after a marathon PR. One guy who always comes is like, oh, he's got another PR. Now he's down to 245 and now he's down to 240. And he's driven back from New York to North Carolina and comes onto the mat. While he can do that, that's just not generally, I'd much rather just have somebody go take the dog for a walk of 1 mile and not feel like they need to come to class in a state of that level of fatigue. Because at that point, I think you're kind of hitting diminishing returns. Or conversely, people come to class because they have taper madness and they've got a whole bunch of energy to burn. So they'll show up and think, oh, I'll do yoga. Yoga is easy. But if the sequence that day is actually not that easy, you could wind up kind of spending some of your reserved energy that you meant to use on the race out on the yoga mat. And that would be another problem.
The taper crazies are such a real phenomenon.
I know.
Yeah, they can certainly lead runners to do all sorts of crazy things that are not in the interests of their race. But you're absolutely right about keeping your eyes on your own mat and not looking around and comparing yourself to others. Runners do this all the time with, how many miles a week are you running? What's your long run at? What are your splits like from that workout? I think runners are, by almost their nature, people who like to compare themselves to others because our sport is so objective. We can put a number on someone's performance and then rank those just simply by which one is faster and which one's slower. And I think that's kind of a mental hitch that a lot of runners have. But we have to understand that, whether we're in the yoga room or we're in the weight room trying to squat some weight, it's not a competition. And, I remember doing Bikram yoga and looking around at very competent people, and I was not one of them. And trying to do a challenging Bikram yoga class after, over 80 miles a week of running. I remember doing a Sunday night class all the time. This was after a weekend of running, close to 30 miles total. It was really challenging. And I understood that if I was doing poses like the competent people in my class, then I probably wouldn't been able to train as hard as I was. So it's that balancing act that you were talking about. And I think that's really important to kind of keep in mind as any runner goes to a yoga class or is just doing them themselves at home. Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to transition a little bit and talk about the mental side of yoga, because I think this is just as valuable as the physical side of things. And I enjoyed going to a yoga class after, a hard week of training. And part of the reason was because it was, an hour or maybe an hour and a half for me to unwind and focus without struggling too much. It's not like I'm focusing during a tempo run or something like that. And I just got this hour of calm that was so different from running. Can you talk about some of the mental benefits of yoga and how that can transfer over really well to running?
Absolutely. One I already mentioned is the sense of equanimity, the ability to come back to center even as circumstance is changing. Another is your awareness of your breath, which has direct application to your running. And breath is so key to, it's key to everything we do all the time, but it's especially at the forefront in a yoga practice, as we often cue the movements to the breath. And that's a beautiful thing for runners to pay attention to at every pace. Like, how is my breath coordinating with my movement? What foot is hitting the ground when I start my breath in? And how many steps am I taking on that inhale? What foot is hitting the ground as I start my breath out? How many steps does the exhalation last? How does my pace vary from warm up to 10K pace to 5K pace to 400 meter pace? All of these are really good questions for folks to have answers to so that they have a baseline breath to come back to. And paying attention to the breath helps to develop a sense of focus, a sense of single-pointed concentration is the term that we use sometimes in yoga class. And we also develop that not just with awareness of the breath, but with a gazing point. You might remember from your Bikram experience, there would be a direction like, look at your eyes in the mirror. Or if you're in another class, sometimes they'll say like, look back toward your belly button or look down toward the floor so that you feel a little bit more steady in your balance pose. That's what we call in yoga drishti or gazing point. And that's really helpful. And that works for us as runners. We're all familiar with that. We're like, just run to that mailbox, just run to that lamppost, just run to the mile marker. And then I get to walk for 1 minute or whatever it is. Another way that we learn focus is through mantra. Mantra is a word that just means mind tool. So we all know that as runners as well. And if you have a song stuck in your head, that's a mantra. If you're counting steps or whatever, that's a mantra. If you've got a mantra like light and smooth. Finally, a way that yoga really helps us is it develops a sense of presence as well. And I like to define presence as an awareness of many things at once. So focus is your ability to sustain attention on one thing over time. Presence is your ability to hold many things in your awareness at one time. Depending on the kind of competition you do, if you compete, you might be more in the focus camp or more in the presence camp. So focus would be you running for your own personal best time, but presence is really critical if you're racing for place or if you're racing cross country or if you're racing like a super long distance, because you've got to be aware of more than just your pace, but also where's your next aid station, what's the terrain like, and several other things at once.
To me, these are skills that lend themselves really well to running races because there's a lot of anxiety that can be paired with racing, particularly when you are putting a lot of pressure on yourself to either finish well or run faster than you've ever have before. And when you get into those situations, you can be at mile 18 of a marathon and things start going south, or, things are even going well, but you're feeling the normal fatigue that, comes with being at mile 18 of a marathon. And to be in those scenarios, that position, you have to be able to focus on the task at hand while being aware of your surroundings. And, I was able to get, pretty decent at this just through a lot of repetition. But I think because I learned, how to be a runner, when I first started running, we didn't have GPS watches. The internet was barely around at the time. And I do feel like at this point in time, we should be doing everything we can to boost our ability to single task, to focus, and to really be present on what we're doing, because there's so many distractions today. And if you can take a step back and run your long runs without any music or no podcasts, sacrilege coming from a podcaster right now. But, do things that require you to single task, things like long runs without any earbuds, or a 90-minute yoga sequence once a week, or even just 30 minutes a couple times a week. These are skills that are going to help you develop mental fitness, which I think carries over to running, because running is such a mental sport. And if you can build mental skills and fitness in other areas of your life, that is only going to help your running and only help you become a better runner.
Right on.
So, Sage, this has been really interesting to me. I love talking about things where I only know a little bit about, so I get to learn so much, and I really appreciate you being here. Now, I'll be the first one to admit, yoga is not my specialty, and I'm just not very knowledgeable about the practice. And so with that said, is there anything that I missed today that our listeners should know about yoga that could potentially help their running?
We didn't get time to talk too much about my favorite style of yoga, which is called restorative yoga. It is every bit as good as it sounds. It's lying around on pillows and blankets by candlelight with soft music playing, and you just lie there. And the goal of each of the restorative yoga poses is never to feel a stretch, but instead to soothe your nervous system, which is a way to jumpstart your recovery. So it's a really beautiful complement to an active yoga practice, and it's a really beautiful complement to your running. And give yourself a chance for that total timeout. Like you said, 90 minutes of not having to think about other things. That this is just as good as a massage. And I say that as the owner of a spa and massage school. Restorative yoga is the cheaper version, and it's absolutely lovely once you have the skills to relax. And the harder you can relax and the better you can recover, then the more you can bring your best self to bear on your next workout or your next race.
Well, I haven't heard of this practice of yoga. I'm not familiar with it whatsoever. Can you tell us more about it? I mean, what would a restorative yoga session look like?
In a 90-minute session, you would probably do 4 poses or maybe 5, and you'd hold each of them for somewhere between like 15 and 25 or even 30 minutes, completely supported by props. So do you know a pose called legs up the wall, Jason?
I can guess, but I don't officially know.
So it's like taking an L pose at the wall. And that's something that is in and of itself prop-free, nice for your recovery because it helps to recirculate some of the interstitial fluid that accumulates in your ankles, say during your long run. So legs up the wall would be great to do after you get out of the shower, after your long run. But in a restorative yoga class, you would do it with all kinds of props underneath you. Like you would have a bolster underneath your hips, and you would have blankets underneath your back so that you can stay there for a long time without feeling the hard floor. You might have a pillow and an eye pillow over your face and a sandbag over your feet to help weight your thigh bones down into your hip sockets and help settle and soothe. It's designed to work on the nervous system, so to engage the relaxation response and to ramp up the parasympathetic side of the nervous system. And it's just delicious. So restorative class would be a few poses held for a really long time, but without much sensation at all, to give your body time to just kind of float away. Sometimes, and I teach restorative, I say we're playing the edge. We're just playing the other edge. And we know as runners what the upper edge is like, it's where you can just barely keep it together and maintain a constant pace. But there's another edge, and it's down at the soft side of things. And the worst thing that happens if you mess up at that edge is you fall asleep. And that's not the end of the world.
No, certainly not. This sounds like something that would be really beneficial, say, the week after you run a marathon.
Absolutely.
So at the end of a season, when you're really tired, you're just ready to not exercise for a little while and let your body recover and get back to neutral. This is the time and place for restorative yoga.
It's also a really nice rest day practice, and it's a good practice to do the day before or even 2 days before a marathon where you might be getting a massage. You could swap it out for restorative yoga.
Well, great. Sage, this was awesome. I now know more about different types of yoga and more about, What I liked about this conversation was not just how, you talked about the benefits of yoga and how to get started and what you can expect, but your expertise and passion for yoga really came across. And I just want to thank you for that. And I appreciate you coming on the show to talk more about how we can all benefit from yoga. Because I think as runners, we just want to run, but there's so many other things that we can do in our training to supplement our running and to really enhance our running. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the great questions and conversation.
All right, I hope you enjoyed my discussion about yoga and the many reasons it can help your running with the always entertaining and educational Sage Rountree. I also want to let you know that we have a great yoga sequence available on the Strength Running blog. It's about 10 minutes. It focuses on a hip opening sequence and is really great once or twice a week to help you keep feeling supple and ready for those long runs and challenging workouts. If you go to strengthrunning.com/yoga, you'll be able to see the video and a description of the routine. But finally, before you turn me off today, you should definitely check out SteadyMD, which is led by sub-3 marathoner Dr. Josh Emder. The goal is to give you a personal primary care doctor online that's just for runners to help you stay fit, healthy, injury-free, and competitive. The best part? There are no copays, waiting rooms, or surprise bills. Instead, you're going to get same-day responses from a doctor who's there for you 24/7. Now, if you've ever seen a doctor or even a physical therapist who doesn't have any experience with runners or treating injuries or training, then you know how valuable this is to hard-charging athletes. Having a doctor who gets you, who understands training and your running goals is priceless. Go to steadymd.com/strengthrunning to see if there are any spots left and how you can benefit from having a PCP who's also a runner. That's steadymd.com/strengthrunning to see all the details. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for all the recent Apple Music reviews. I appreciate those so much. And until next time, we'll be in touch soon.